There's a particular kind of exhaustion that arrives not from what you've done, but from what you haven't done yet. It's 11:47 p.m. Your body wants sleep, but your mind is 3 conversations ahead, rehearsing tomorrow's meeting for the 3rd time tonight. Not the content. You know what you need to say. You're rehearsing the delivery, the facial expressions, the precise moment to pause. You're playing both roles, adjusting your lines based on imagined reactions, testing dialogue that hasn't happened yet, with the intensity of an actor preparing for opening night. Except the performance is a simple conversation about a schedule change. And somehow this small conversation feels dangerous. And here's what makes this so isolating. You can't explain why this feels necessary. Skip the rehearsal and something terrible might happen, though you couldn't articulate what. So you lie there, running simulations in the dark, your mind treating a casual interaction like a hostage negotiation that requires perfect execution. This isn't social anxiety. It's a learned survival strategy. This isn't introversion or overthinking. This is something more specific, more hidden. The psychology of people who rehearse conversations in their head. And if you've ever spent hours preparing for a 30-second exchange, if you've ever felt like your spontaneous self isn't safe enough to exist without a script, you'll recognize what we're about to explore. This is the neuroscience of conversational rehearsal, and it reveals something profound about how the mind protects itself. This is the neuroscience of conversational rehearsal, and it reveals something profound about how the mind protects itself. In the next few minutes, we're going to look at why your brain treats a simple chat like a hostage negotiation, and how to finally feel safe enough to stop. Most people assume this pattern is about perfectionism or anxiety. Prepare thoroughly enough, and the conversation will go smoothly. But that surface explanation misses the mechanism entirely. Conversational rehearsal of this intensity isn't really about the upcoming interaction at all. It's your mind's attempt to achieve emotional safety in a social world that once felt unpredictable or punishing. Recent neuroimaging research in cognitive neuroscience reveals something remarkable. When you mentally rehearse a conversation, your brain activates the same neural networks involved in actual conversation. The prefrontal cortex orchestrates scenario planning. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors for potential social threats. Your brain is essentially running a simulation so detailed, so immersive, that neurologically, you're having the conversation before it happens. To your nervous system, this isn't imagination, it's preparation for danger. Scientists call this prospective cognition, the ability to mentally time travel into future scenarios. But in conversational rehearsal taken to extremes, this extraordinary cognitive capacity becomes a protective mechanism operating beyond conscious choice. Your mind isn't just planning, it's attempting to control an inherently uncontrollable future, and that distinction changes everything. Today, we're going beneath the rehearsal to understand what it's really protecting you from. Because once you see the architecture underlying this pattern, it stops being a personal failing and starts revealing itself as an intelligent adaptation with real costs. This is complex. It has layers that psychology rarely discusses openly. And understanding those layers might be exactly what helps you recognize why your mind does this, and what it would take for it to feel safe enough to stop. Let's begin with what this actually feels like from the inside. Because not everyone who thinks about conversations beforehand is caught in this pattern. Plenty of people mentally prepare for important discussions. That's normal planning. What we're examining is something different. The specific quality where rehearsal becomes compulsive, where spontaneity feels dangerous, where the gap between your internal script and the actual interaction creates profound disconnection. You're having coffee with a colleague tomorrow. Simple agenda, discussing a project timeline. But tonight, your mind is running the conversation on repeat. You're not just thinking about what you'll say, you're scripting the exact words, imagining their response, preparing your counter-response, adjusting based on their likely mood, planning your facial expressions, calibrating your tone. You're choreographing a dance where you play both dancers, trying to eliminate every variable that might lead to misunderstanding or judgment. Your body registers this as work. Your shoulders tense, your jaw clenches slightly. There's a low-grade vigilance humming beneath your thoughts, the same nervous system activation that would occur if you were preparing for actual threat. Because to your brain, this is threat. Social rejection, misunderstanding, being perceived as awkward or incompetent, these dangers feel as real as physical harm. More real, actually, because your history has taught you that social rupture cuts deeper than anything visible. And here's where it gets exhausting. The rehearsal never ends. Even after you've run the script 10 times, your mind finds new contingencies. What if they seem annoyed? What if they interrupt? What if your carefully prepared response doesn't match the actual question they ask? So you rehearse variations, branch scenarios, backup plans. Your mental simulation grows more elaborate, more detailed, creating a conversational map so comprehensive that the actual interaction feels like following a script you've already memorized. But something crucial happens in this process. The rehearsed conversation starts feeling more real than the one that hasn't occurred yet. You've lived it so many times in your mind that the actual exchange becomes almost redundant, a formality your body has to perform to catch up with what your brain already experienced. And in that gap, something essential gets lost. Presence, spontaneity, the possibility of genuine connection that can only emerge when two people meet each other unrehearsed. Psychologists studying metacognition, awareness of one's own mental processes, have identified what they call excessive cognitive self-monitoring in people who rehearse conversations compulsively. It's a hyper-awareness of your own thoughts and expressions that paradoxically makes authentic interaction harder. You're simultaneously having the conversation and watching yourself have the conversation and evaluating your performance in the conversation. 3 layers of awareness creating distance from the raw, unfiltered experience of simply talking to another human being. The rehearsed version feels safe precisely because it's controlled. You've eliminated surprise, managed variables, reduced the probability of saying something wrong. But the actual conversation carries the unbearable uncertainty of another person's genuine response. And for someone whose nervous system learned early that unpredictable responses mean danger, that uncertainty isn't just uncomfortable, it's intolerable. So you prepare, you rehearse, you script, not because you're anxious in some generalized way, but because your brain has learned, through thousands of micro-experiences, that your spontaneous self creates problems. The solution your mind developed is elegant in its logic. Test the interaction mentally first, and you'll never have to risk the devastation of being yourself and having that self be unacceptable. But here's what most people don't realize. This pattern doesn't start in adulthood. It doesn't begin the first time you rehearse a conversation. It has roots that go deeper than conscious memory into the developmental soil where your relational brain was forming its fundamental templates about safety, expression, and what it means to be known by another person. Long before you learned to rehearse conversations, you learned something more fundamental, whether your spontaneous expressions were safe. And that learning didn't happen through explicit teaching. It happened through thousands of micro-interactions where you revealed yourself and observed what came back. Developmental psychologists studying attachment and early relational patterns have discovered that children are extraordinarily attuned to their caregivers' emotional states, not just the obvious displays of anger or joy, but the subtle shifts, the slight edge in a parent's voice, the half-second delay before they respond, the way their smile doesn't quite reach their eyes when they're stressed. Children become sophisticated readers of these signals because their survival depends on accurately predicting the emotional weather of their environment. In homes where emotional responses are consistent and attuned, where a child's expression is met with curiosity and acceptance regardless of the parent's mood, kids learn that their authentic self is manageable to others and therefore safe to express. But in environments where emotional safety is inconsistent, where a parent's receptivity depends on factors the child can't control, something different gets encoded. This isn't necessarily overt trauma. It can develop in families where love exists, but emotional safety doesn't, where a parent is physically present but emotionally unpredictable, where the same behavior gets praised one day and criticized the next, depending on variables invisible to a child, where expressions of need are sometimes met with warmth and sometimes with irritation or withdrawal, where a child learns to become a careful student of their parent's state before revealing their own. The child's brain, with its extraordinary adaptive capacity, begins developing a solution. Instead of expressing spontaneously and hoping for attunement, the child learns to test the emotional waters first, to read the room, to adjust their presentation based on what seems safe in that particular moment. They're not consciously strategizing. They're adapting to conditions that require careful social navigation to maintain connection. This is where conversational rehearsal has its origins, not in the conversations themselves, but in the fundamental template that says your unfiltered self creates problems, but your carefully managed self might be acceptable. What if you're not rehearsing to sound good, but to avoid being rejected? Pause for a second. Think about the last conversation you spent hours rehearsing. Did it actually go the way you planned? Or did the script feel like a cage once the person started talking? The brain learns that there's a gap between who you are and who you need to be for others to remain available. And managing that gap becomes an automated process. Attachment researchers describe these patterns using specific terminology. In secure attachment, children develop what's called reflective function, the capacity to understand their own mental states and those of others with flexibility and curiosity. But in insecure attachment patterns, particularly anxious attachment, children develop what researchers identify as hyperactivated attachment strategies. The child becomes preoccupied with the availability and responsiveness of their caregiver, constantly monitoring for signs of approval or rejection. That same monitoring doesn't disappear in adulthood, it evolves. It becomes more sophisticated, and in conversational rehearsal you can see its signature. The constant scanning for how your words might land, the hypervigilance about others' responses, the desperate attempt to manage perception because your history taught you that being misunderstood or misjudged threatens connection itself. Here's what this looks like neurologically. Your amygdala, your brain's threat detection system, learned to categorize social unpredictability as danger. Not dramatic danger, but the kind that erodes safety gradually, like shoreline wearing away under waves you barely notice until the landscape has completely changed. When you approach a conversation, your amygdala activates before conscious thought catches up. It's not responding to the actual interaction. It's responding to the category, unscripted social exchange equals potential rejection. Your prefrontal cortex, trying to help, develops an elaborate strategy. Eliminate the unpredictability through mental preparation. If you can anticipate every possible response, script every contingency, you can reduce the threat your amygdala detects. So you rehearse. And each time a conversation goes smoothly after rehearsal, your brain codes this as evidence that the preparation prevented catastrophe. The pattern reinforces itself through what psychologists call a safety behavior, an action that temporarily reduces anxiety while maintaining the underlying fear. The profound truth is this: you're not broken, you're adapted. Your mind developed conversational rehearsal as an intelligent response to conditions that genuinely required careful social navigation. The strategy served you. It protected you. It helped you maintain connection in an environment where spontaneous expression carried real risks. But what protects you in childhood can become a constraint in adulthood. And that's where the hidden cost of this pattern begins to reveal itself. Because here's what happens when every interaction requires a script. Relationships develop a curious flatness that's hard to name, but impossible to ignore. From the outside, you might appear completely functional, articulate, pleasant, even charming. People enjoy talking to you. You're good at conversations. You've practiced them extensively in your head, after all. You know how to respond appropriately, how to ask the right questions, how to make others feel heard. But beneath the smooth performance, there's a subtle disconnection that only you can feel fully. Recent research on authenticity and intimacy reveals something most people miss. True connection doesn't emerge from perfect communication. It emerges from the vulnerability of imperfect, unscripted presence. When researchers analyze what creates relationship satisfaction and depth, they consistently find that spontaneity, the capacity to respond genuinely in the moment without excessive filtering, predicts intimacy more strongly than communication skill. This creates a painful paradox for people who rehearse conversations. The very strategy you use to connect more successfully actually prevents genuine connection. Because while you're delivering your carefully prepared lines, reading the other person's responses, adjusting your performance in real time, you're not actually present in the exchange. You're 3 layers removed: performing the script, monitoring how it lands, evaluating your success, all while the actual human sitting across from you remains slightly out of focus. Others sense this, even if they can't articulate it. They might describe you as hard to read, a bit guarded, pleasant but somehow distant. They're picking up on something real, the gap between your rehearsed presentation and your actual internal experience. You're showing them a curated version, not because you're being manipulative, but because showing them your unrehearsed self feels equivalent to standing naked in a spotlight, every flaw and uncertainty exposed to judgment. So you maintain the performance. And relationships that form around your rehearsed self feel safe, but somehow hollow. People think they know you, but they know your script. The parts you've determined are acceptable, the expressions you've tested and found manageable, but the person beneath the script, the one with spontaneous reactions, unfiltered opinions, awkward pauses, uncertain vulnerabilities, that person remains hidden. Not because you don't want to be known, but because being truly known requires the one thing your nervous system has learned is dangerous: showing up unrehearsed. There's a specific quality to conversations when one person is operating from a script and the other isn't. The scripted person maintains control but sacrifices flow. They know what they want to say next, but they're only half listening because they're already preparing their response. Questions feel loaded, not opportunities for genuine curiosity, but potential mines that might require them to deviate from their prepared material. The unscripted person, meanwhile, might feel something slightly off without knowing why. The conversation is perfectly pleasant, nothing overtly wrong, but there's a quality of performance to it, like talking to someone who's simultaneously talking to you and watching themselves talk to you. The natural rhythm of authentic exchange, where unpredictability creates moments of genuine surprise, laughter, connection, gets smoothed over by preparation. Everything flows, but nothing really lands. Research in social neuroscience reveals that human brains are exquisitely tuned to detect authenticity through what scientists call spontaneous synchrony. When 2 people are genuinely present with each other, their physiological states begin to match. Heart rates synchronize, breathing patterns align. Even brain activity shows coordinated patterns. This happens automatically when both people are responding genuinely to the moment. But when one person is operating from a pre-planned script, that synchrony breaks. The other person's brain detects the mismatch at a level beneath conscious awareness. They can't pinpoint what feels off, but they sense it. This person isn't fully here. They're managing the interaction rather than participating in it. And over time, that subtle barrier prevents the kind of intimacy that emerges only when 2 people risk being genuinely seen. The cost isn't just external. In your relationships with others, there's an internal cost that's perhaps even more exhausting: the double consciousness of constantly monitoring your own performance. You're at dinner with friends. The conversation is flowing, people are laughing, you're contributing, but you're not relaxed. Beneath the surface, your mind is running a parallel track. Did that joke land? Was my tone right? Should I have phrased that differently? They seem to react less enthusiastically than I expected. Did I misjudge? What should I say next to steer things back? It's like being in a play where you're simultaneously the actor, the director, and the audience. You can never just be in the scene because you're always evaluating the scene. And that constant evaluation is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to people who don't experience it. You come home from social interactions drained, not because the interaction itself was demanding, but because monitoring yourself was. Psychologists studying rumination and social anxiety have found that this pattern creates what they call post-event processing. After a conversation ends, you replay it, analyzing your performance, identifying mistakes, rehearsing what you should have said differently. So the conversation never really ends. You're either pre-rehearsing the next one or post-analyzing the last one. with almost no mental space left for simply being in unrehearsed present time. And here's the cruelest part. This is happening. You're aware that you're overthinking, over-preparing, over-monitoring, but knowing doesn't stop it, because the knowing is part of the problem. You're hyper-aware of your own mental processes, watching yourself rehearse, judging yourself for needing to rehearse, feeling ashamed that you can't just be spontaneous like everyone else seems to be. This creates a vicious cycle. The awareness of your need to rehearse makes you feel more defective. That sense of defectiveness increases the stakes of social interaction. You need to perform well to prove you're acceptable. Higher stakes mean more anxiety. More anxiety means more rehearsal. And round it goes, each cycle reinforcing the pattern that came before. What makes this pattern so resistant to change is that it works. Sort of. Your rehearsed conversations often do go smoothly. People respond positively. You avoid saying something awkward or being misunderstood. Each successful interaction after rehearsal provides evidence that the preparation was necessary. Your brain attributes the smooth outcome to your careful planning, even though the conversation likely would have gone fine without any rehearsal at all. This is what psychologists studying anxiety call a safety behavior, an action you take to prevent a feared outcome. The problem with safety behaviors is that they prevent you from learning that the feared outcome wouldn't happen anyway. As long as you rehearse before conversations, you never gather evidence that unrehearsed conversation is safe. You never discover that people can accept your spontaneous self because you never show them your spontaneous self. The mind holds a deep, often unconscious belief. If I don't rehearse, I will say something wrong. I'll be awkward. They'll judge me. I'll be rejected. These aren't irrational fears. They're based on real experiences where unfiltered expression did lead to rupture, criticism, or withdrawal. Your mind isn't catastrophizing. It's protecting you from pain it has already experienced. But here's where it gets complex. The original conditions that made rehearsal necessary, the emotionally inconsistent parent, the unpredictable relational environment, the implicit message that your spontaneous self created problems, those conditions no longer exist. The people you're interacting with now aren't the people who taught you that unscripted expression was dangerous. But your nervous system doesn't know that. It's still operating from a threat model formed years ago, in circumstances that no longer apply. Neuroscientists studying fear and safety learning have discovered that the brain's threat detection system is remarkably conservative. Once it learns that a situation is dangerous, it maintains that categorization even after the danger has passed. This makes evolutionary sense. Better to be overly cautious than to miss a real threat. But it also means that patterns developed for survival can persist long after they're needed, operating automatically beneath conscious awareness. Your rehearsal isn't a choice you're making in the present moment. It's an automated response your nervous system developed in the past, triggered by any situation that resembles the original conditions where spontaneity was punished. And until your nervous system receives consistent evidence that unscripted expression in the present is genuinely safe, the pattern will continue regardless of how much you intellectually understand its limitations. This is why insight alone doesn't change the pattern. You can understand perfectly why you rehearse conversations. You can trace it back to childhood experiences. You can recognize it's maladaptive. But that understanding lives in your prefrontal cortex, the thinking, reasoning part of your brain. The rehearsal pattern lives deeper, in structures like the amygdala and the basal ganglia, where learned behaviors become automatic and resistant to conscious intervention. Changing this pattern requires something more than understanding. It requires what neuroscientists call safety learning, gradually teaching your nervous system through direct experience that the threat it's preparing for no longer exists. And that process is neither quick nor linear. But here's what changes when you understand the architecture underlying this pattern. You stop blaming yourself. You recognize that conversational rehearsal isn't a personal failing. It's not evidence that you're socially inept or anxious by nature. It's an intelligent adaptation your mind developed under specific conditions. That adaptation served you, protected you, helped you survive in an environment where careful social navigation was genuinely necessary. The work now isn't becoming someone who never thinks about conversations beforehand. That's not realistic or even desirable. Some situations genuinely benefit from forethought. The work is developing what psychologists call flexible responding, the capacity to distinguish between useful planning and protective rehearsal, and to gradually build the internal safety that makes unrehearsed expression feel possible. This begins with recognizing when you're rehearsing, not to stop it forcefully, but to notice it with curiosity rather than judgment. What am I preparing for? What am I afraid might happen if I don't rehearse? Beneath the specific conversational content, what deeper fear is this rehearsal protecting me from? Usually, when you sit with these questions honestly, the answer has less to do with the upcoming conversation and more to do with fundamental fears about acceptability. If I speak without filtering, they'll see who I really am. And who I really am isn't acceptable. That belief, that your unrehearsed self is fundamentally unacceptable, is the wound that maintains the entire pattern. And healing that wound doesn't happen through more rehearsal or through forcing yourself to be spontaneous. It happens through corrective experiences where you risk showing up less prepared and the feared catastrophe doesn't materialize. Research on attachment and relational healing describes this process as developing earned security. Unlike the secure attachment that forms when early relationships consistently provide safety, earned security develops later in life through relationships where you gradually discover that authentic expression doesn't threaten connection. These are relationships where imperfect communication is met with curiosity rather than judgment, where repair is possible after misunderstanding, where being known matters more than being impressive. You don't find these relationships by searching for them explicitly. You find them by slowly, carefully practicing being less rehearsed in low-stakes situations. Maybe it's allowing an awkward pause in conversation instead of having a prepared response ready. Maybe it's sharing a half-formed thought without perfecting it first. Maybe it's asking a question you're genuinely curious about, rather than a question designed to steer the conversation safely. These moments feel vulnerable. Your nervous system will sound alarms. Your mind will want to retreat to scripted safety. But each time you tolerate that discomfort and the conversation continues, you're gathering evidence. Evidence that spontaneity doesn't equal catastrophe. Evidence that people can handle your unfiltered self. Evidence that connection might actually deepen when you're less controlled, not more. This process is gradual. Your nervous system won't suddenly decide that unscripted expression is safe based on one positive experience. It needs consistent, repeated evidence over time, and it needs that evidence to come from your body's direct experience, not from logical reasoning. You have to feel, physically, that showing up unrehearsed didn't lead to rejection, that the other person stayed. That connection survived imperfection, that you survived being seen. Some people find this safety learning through therapy, particularly approaches that work with the nervous system directly, somatic therapy, EMDR, or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. These modalities help update the threat models stored in your body, teaching your amygdala that conditions have changed. Others find it through relationships with people who consistently respond to vulnerability with acceptance, slowly rewiring the expectation that authentic expression leads to loss. But here's what's crucial to understand. The goal isn't to eliminate all mental preparation. It isn't to valorize impulsivity or thoughtlessness. Some conversations genuinely benefit from forethought. The goal is choice. The capacity to notice when rehearsal serves you versus when it constrains you. The freedom to prepare when preparation is useful, and to show up unrehearsed when spontaneity would create more connection than control. And perhaps most importantly, recognizing that the person you're rehearsing how to be already exists. You're not creating an acceptable self through careful preparation. You're hiding your actual self behind performance. And while that performance once protected you from real danger, it now protects you from something else entirely. From discovering that maybe possibly, with the right people in the right circumstances, your unrehearsed self might actually be not just acceptable but welcome. The journey from compulsive rehearsal to flexible responding is neither simple nor linear. Some days you'll manage spontaneity easily. Other days, your nervous system will flood with the old fear, and you'll find yourself rehearsing despite your best intentions. That's not regression. That's how nervous system change works. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, with gradual overall movement toward greater flexibility. If this cycle of rehearsal feels like your default mode, leave a comment below. Just knowing how many of us are running simulations in the dark can be the first step toward breaking the isolation this habit creates. What matters is maintaining compassion for yourself throughout this process. Your rehearsal habit developed for a reason. It served a purpose. It kept you emotionally intact in circumstances that would have damaged others. You're not lazy or weak for struggling to change it. You're working against years of learned neural patterns that were once necessary for survival. And here's something worth holding on to: the same mind capable of such elaborate scenario planning, such detailed mental simulation, such sophisticated prediction of others' responses. That mind is also capable of remarkable adaptation when given consistent evidence that the threat model has changed. Your brain's plasticity, the same quality that allowed it to learn the rehearsal pattern in the first place, can learn new patterns when conditions support it. The possibility isn't that you'll wake up one day and never think about conversations beforehand. The possibility is that slowly, gradually, through countless small acts of unrehearsed courage, your nervous system begins to recognize something it never learned early on. That being known, genuinely known, not carefully presented, doesn't destroy connection. Sometimes improbably, vulnerably, it creates the kind of connection your scripted self could never access. This isn't about fixing yourself. You're not broken. You're someone whose brilliant adaptive mind learned to survive conditions that required careful management of self-expression. That survival strategy was intelligent, necessary. But survival strategies that serve us in one context can limit us in another. And recognizing that limitation with compassion rather than shame, that's where possibility begins. If you've lived this pattern, I need you to understand something. You're not too anxious. You're not overthinking. You're not socially defective. You're someone whose nervous system learned through direct experience that spontaneous expression carried risks. Your mind developed conversational rehearsal as a sophisticated solution to a real problem. That's not pathology. That's adaptation operating at extraordinary intelligence. Does understanding this make the pattern easier to change? Not automatically. Knowing why your system rehearses conversations doesn't immediately stop the compulsion, but it does something perhaps more important. It transforms self-blame into self-understanding, and from that foundation of understanding, change becomes possible in ways it never was when you were fighting yourself. The path forward isn't about eliminating rehearsal through willpower. It's about gradually, gently, in safe enough relationships and low-stakes situations, gathering evidence that your unrehearsed self can be met with acceptance. It's about teaching your protective mind through direct experience rather than logic that the threat it's preparing for exists more in memory than in present reality. This is slow work. Neural rewiring doesn't happen quickly, but it does happen. Attachment researchers have documented it. Neuroscientists have measured it. Therapists have witnessed it. People who once needed to script every interaction have developed the capacity for spontaneous connection, not because they forced themselves to stop rehearsing, but because they gradually discovered that showing up unrehearsed, in the right circumstances, with the right people, didn't lead to the catastrophe their nervous system had learned to expect. And somewhere in that discovery, between the third time you allow an awkward silence instead of filling it with prepared content, or the fifth time you share a half-formed thought without perfecting it first, or the 10th time you let someone see you uncertain and they respond with curiosity rather than judgment, something shifts, not dramatically, not permanently, but real. A subtle recognition that maybe, possibly, your spontaneous self deserves to exist in conversation without requiring a script. That recognition doesn't solve everything. You'll still rehearse sometimes. Your nervous system will still sound alarms in unfamiliar situations, but you'll have gathered evidence that the alarm doesn't always mean danger, and gradually the gap between your internal experience and your external expression begins to close. Not because you've perfected your performance, but because you've started to trust that imperfect, unrehearsed presence won't destroy you. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, you're not broken, and you're not alone. In the end, this isn't about becoming someone who never thinks about conversations beforehand. It's about developing the internal safety that makes thinking about conversations a choice rather than a compulsion. It's about recognizing that the elaborate mental preparation your mind performs is evidence of extraordinary cognitive capacity, and that same capacity can learn to rest when conditions genuinely support it. The person you're rehearsing how to be is already here. They're buried beneath years of careful preparation, but they exist. They have opinions they haven't filtered, questions they haven't sanitized, vulnerabilities they haven't packaged into acceptable presentation. They're imperfect, uncertain, sometimes awkward, and that's precisely what makes them capable of genuine connection. The work isn't becoming that person through better performance. The work is discovering, gradually and with great gentleness, that you're safe enough to let them speak without a script, that their unrehearsed voice, for all its imperfection, deserves to be heard by others, yes, but perhaps most importantly, by you. If this video helped you name something you've carried wordlessly, you're not alone. That moment of recognition, the sense that someone finally understands this specific struggle, is where change begins. Not because understanding solves the pattern, but because it removes the shame that keeps the pattern hidden and therefore unchangeable. This channel exists for people who feel deeply and think carefully about what it means to be human. If you'd like to continue these conversations about the hidden psychology underlying the patterns we rarely discuss openly, consider subscribing. And if any part of this resonated, share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to feel less alone in their own rehearsal habit. Take care of yourself. You deserve understanding, not judgment, especially from your own mind.